friends and fellow readers. Thanks for joining us for another adventure in Caribbean literature. Today, we're going to be discussing Blackheart Man, and we have with us Nalo Hopkinson, the author of the novel. Welcome, Nalo.
Thank you.
And also, those of you who watch us often will not know Deborah, not from this program, but she has been a contributing author in other PageTurners Plus programs. So, Deborah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paula. Thanks for having me.
Now, let me start from the very beginning, from the concept you drew on to create this novel. The
Mhm.
Blackheart Man is a character we know in some of the Caribbean territories, but he doesn't exist in every territory. So could you just explain to our audience who the Blackheart Man is and why you decided to draw on him in creating this novel?
All right. Blackheart Man, I'm from Jamaica, and I think that's where I first heard about the Blackheart Man. And I know of him as a story that some parents would tell their children to scare them into behaving. And the Blackheart Man is supposed to be somebody who preys on children. He arrives in a black car or a black carriage, and he kidnaps children and um, steals the living hearts from their bodies and eats them. Um, so that is where what I had learned. And then many years ago, I was talking with Karen Lord, and we were talking about folklore, and Karen is from Barbados. And she said the equivalent there is the Heart Man, but it's the same story. Um, I drew on it in part because I use folklore a lot in my writing. And it's such a extreme image that it stuck with me. So it just came up when I was building the ideas for this novel.
I am aware of the myth and the lore of the Black Heart Man and the Barbadian iterations. I am keen, or at least more interested in the historical kind of liberties that you take with this story. I while I was reading it, I was thinking about how you would classify it because it has all of these elements, fantasy. It feels like alternate history, and then I want to say it's alternate Caribbean futures as well. So I was just wondering what was the process like in determining the overall product, the
Hmm.
project, the end project. I
Hmm.
was reading as well in Falling in Love with Hominids that you took some inspiration from, is it Kulimbo? I think it's called
From
Soul Case. The
oh yeah,
preface,
yeah,
Soul
yeah.
Case, right?
Hmm.
The film Kulimbo, which quote uses iconography.
Yes, yes, Quilombo.
Yes,
Yes, yes.
yes. So I was wondering if you could speak on that a bit, please.
Well, all of that you're describing fits under fantasy writing. It's a fantasy novel. The part about Caribbean futures w- was not something I put in there intentionally, but you're not the only person to say that it's Maxofuturism. Sometimes I don't know what I'm doing. It just happens. But the idea of alternate history, alternate Caribbean history, of taking creative liberties with history is all something that fantasy does, and that has recourse usually to a central fantastical element of the world. So the whole world in the story is in many ways fantastical. My agent, when he first read it, said, you just wrote a fantasy novel that breaks fantasy. So by the end, the large fantasy element has been disbanded with, but it's still, in my mind, a fantasy novel.
Will you tell us, Nalo, about some of the folklore and history, um, other than the Blackheart Man, that you drew on to create this novel?
Hmm. Well, Deborah's mentioned Quilombo, that film by, I think the filmmaker's name is Diegues, that looks at Palmares in Brazil, which was a uh, colony formed by Africans who'd escaped plantation and set up their own community in the bush. And that happened right across wherever you had African slavery that happened from Florida all the way down. So that's always been an inspiring part of our history for me, that we fought so hard to retain our ways and to retain our freedom, as people will do everywhere. So that is part of it. The Blackheart Man story is part of it. Wow, there's so much that went into this novel, and it started at 15 years ago, so things start to fade. Sometimes I completely invented folklore. So there's the one about the man who kills the Cascadoo, but there's a Trinidadian story about a village that an ancient village that does something that was forbidden. They killed and ate a hummingbird, and the next day the pitch, because Trinidad has its own pitch lake, the pitch rose up and covered the village. And there's something really I found really compelling in that story too. The idea of the pitch as a form of retribution, but also as an explanation for why in the pitch lake every so often something really ancient will arise up out of the pitch, that it has preserved history in so many ways. So I wanted to use the combined idea of the pitch lake and of the I'm going to call it fantasy element because that's what my genre calls it, but the idea that there's some price to be paid for destroying the sacred. So that made it in there too, and I'm sure there's other things. Oh yes, the camels. Um, in There are old maps of Barbados where you can find they've drawn little camels across the map, and Barbados does not have camels. But it turns out that apparently at one point camels were imported into Barbados, as they did in many countries. They did it here in Canada. I'm in Vancouver, Canada right now. They did it in the US because they thought that camels would be a good source of, they'd be good pack animals. Turns out camels' feet are adapted for deserts. They don't deal well with rough terrain. Um, and as with so many things that happened with stuff getting imported into the Caribbean by colonizers, they really didn't know how to handle them properly in the first place. So camels are no longer in Barbados. I don't know why, but I do know that a lot of the enslaved peoples had to feed themselves, and a camel is a lot of meat. That is my imagination about what might have happened to the camels. But I love those old maps of the little camels in this place that you really don't expect to find them. So I had to put in camels in my story.
Speaking of maps, while reading this very rich world building, very rich textual story, I kept trying to visualize what these spaces would look like. And I was wondering if perhaps there was a map for the Chin Chin, for the world of the Blackheart Man that you had visualized while you were creating this story, and if maybe in a reissue we might be able to see such a map
It's not,
in keeping with the fantasy tradition, especially.
I am not one of those fantasy writers who works from maps. My visual brain does not work very well. I did draw a very simple map that is a shape of the country. It's kind of oblong on an angle because I needed to know where the various towns and cities were in relation to each other. But that is usually invisible to me when I read another person's story. It just doesn't register. So I have a very, very rudimentary map I could probably find somewhere and share with you, Deborah, but I have a feeling that um, it is so rudimentary that the publisher is not going to be interested in putting it in. It's basically a line drawing with a few dots on it. But I'm gratified to know that you're able to imagine what I wrote because I have trouble doing so.
Let me take you back to the history, Nalo. Um, Chin Chin is an island where the inhabitants, the inhabitants conquered or pushed out the colonizers. And they did so before colonialism could really impact the minds of the inhabitants. Um,
Mm-mm.
why did you want to explore a setting like that where there's this Caribbean space? but people's minds aren't colonized.
There's something magical and very nourishing about the Caribbean and the hybridization that we have achieved, partly by force, but and partly by necessity, and partly because human beings can do that. Um, and there's something really rich about what we have done. Um, that some of it comes out of colonization and adapting and surviving it and change and so I wanted to imagine. I'm very interested in the stories of marronage, of the people who escaped and went into the bush and formed their own communities. And so I thought, what would happen if a community like that was left alone? Palmares is one of the oldest. It lasted 150 years before the Portuguese came back and tried to take it again. And by then, it was such an integral part of its part of Brazil that the neighbors didn't want Palmares destroyed. They were good neighbors. So I thought, what would happen if something like that survived into the 18th century? What would that community be like? And so it was a very rich basis for world building, because you would have people from all kinds of cultures. And this is this is alternate history, so it's not exactly England, and it's not exactly India, and it's not exactly, but you have people from different cultures coming together with different levels of um, power in the society. And I kind of overturned the real world um, stratification of power. So I put indigenous peoples on the top, and peoples of African descent in the middle, and European at the bottom. I just wanted to see what would happen if I overturned it. Um, and there was a lot of fun in imagining that, and a lot of research I had to do in terms of what aspects of the various cultures I would bring into it. I tell people to, though I draw on history a lot, to not read my novels to learn history, because I'm writing fantasy. I will depart from not only known history, I'll depart from known biology, from known, but it was a lot of fun to imagine what this world might be like. And at one point, I was using money, and my partner said, "Why would they have money? They're trying to be independent of the rest of the world." And it took a few years for me to take that on, but once I did, there was an extra richness to the society, because I had to imagine, why would people work? I mean, I come from capitalism. Why would people work if there's no money? Well, people work all the time. So once I freed up my own mind that way, um, I was able to add more richness, I think, to the society.
Awesome. And speaking of hybridization, I noted in terms of the language, there are all of these different registers. I noted in terms of the food, I kept getting hungry listening to the way the food was described. And I'm aware, in addition to the food, the customs, and so on, and I'm aware that one of the ways that you concretize a world is through the food. But there
Mhm.
was it was a duality of an experience for me, because at the same time it's familiar, it's also very strange. So
Yes.
that's why I'm so fascinated with this book. And but to bring it back to code sliding, could you talk a little bit more about that in relation to this question of hybridization of language?
Mhm. The language was actually the most fun for me to write. Writing is difficult for me; it is hard, and writing a novel is a painstaking, if not painful, process. Sometimes painful for sure. But language comes to me fairly naturally, and I lived and grew up in a couple of different places in the Caribbean. Born in Jamaica, lived in Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana. Moved to the US with my family when I was young, and then back to the Caribbean. So I have a number of different Caribbean vernaculars with which I have a level of familiarity. So the code switching comes pretty naturally. But then I had to imagine it into history, where language is used differently. And there I have to thank my dad, probably. Daddy was a trained actor, Shakespearean actor. I'm sort of familiar with how that sounds. and I drew on it a lot. I did have to do a lot of research into various words, various expressions, but I don't recall it being that much because I already have the grounding. So once I moved into a particular mode, like the Mimeki people, they use a lot of Scottish expressions, for instance. Once I moved into a particular mode, it was fairly easy to stay there just because of all the grounding I've had since I was a child in various forms of English. Um, and it is another way of world building that the reader, even if you don't know those particular registers, at some level you recognize something is going on. So it was a lot of fun for me to do that part.
And just to follow up, I noticed as well that you didn't provide a glossary at the back, and I was like, that was just like unapologetic. You will be immersed. There is no time to go to the back of the book and see what this means. Figure it out.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's a challenge for me too. You should be able to figure it out from the context. So it's an ongoing challenge for me um, because I know uh, for myself when I'm reading, I hate going to a glossary. I will read it afterwards, but when I'm in the act of reading, I want to be able to pick it up as I go along. And I remember a novel by, oh damn, I didn't know I was going to be talking about this, and I can't remember her name now. She's a New Zealand author, and whole chunks of her novel um, are are not in English at all. And there is a glossary, but I chose not to read it because I wanted to be able to get the flow of the novel without it. So yeah, there's no glossary because this is language, and I didn't want to put kind of an anthropological kind of gloss on it. I wanted people to be immersed and to survive just the way you do when you go to another country and you speak the same language, but it don't sound the same and you don't recognize some of the words. I wanted that feel to it. And I'm not sure I would have had the level of organization to create a glossary in the first place. ADHD brain is very skittery. I didn't use one when I was writing it.
Deborah has mentioned the hybridization of language. Um, the characters themselves are multi ethnic because that's what we look like in the Caribbean. We're multi ethnic societies. But I noticed, and I was wondering whether you did it deliberately, that you approached the idea of race very much the way we approach it in the Caribbean. We have no such thing as a one drop rule. We identify people by what they look like. So
Hmm.
if you look Indian, even if one of your parents is black, you're Indian.
Hmm.
And if you look Chinese, if one of your parents is white, you're Chinese. And I
Hmm.
was wondering if that was operating in your mind when you were, because I noticed that Zekosi, he is identified as indigenous essentially in the novel.
Hmm.
Um, Samra, who is Mermeki, uh, has African ancestry,
Hmm.
but she is considered Mermeki. So I was
Hmm.
wondering whether you were speaking back, you were talking back to this idea of a one drop rule, or what was going on in your head.
Absolutely. I did not grow up with a one drop rule. It was a curiosity to me when I moved to North America and discovered it. And so there's two things operating in the story, not just how you look like, but also how you identify yourself. So people get to tell you what their background is. And yes, there you can see differences. Bekosi, you can see his indigenous ancestry. Samra, the Mermeki are kind of very blended. She would look, if anything, Ashkenazi. She would be look Jewish to some extent. But yes, also has African ancestry. So I did. I deliberately mixed it up. I wanted it to feel like home. So I deliberately mixed it up, um, knowing that some of that would probably not read to readers who are not Caribbean or who don't come from the same kind of hybridized background. But um, I wanted to try things, so I did it.
I would say that it was very successful. Um, Speaking of Vikosi, I was just reflecting. While reading the text, I kept reflecting on how so much of what he sets out to do, like almost like an embodiment of the expression, the road to hell being paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
And also he strikes me as a trickster type figure, but unlike it, to my memory, unlike any other character that I've read from you. But I could be wrong, so I thought I would ask you if he recalls for you other previous characters, any of your other previous characters, where is he different, where is he similar?
He is, and this whole book is in many ways unlike anything I've done before. And Vekosi is the first time I believe I've tackled a cis male character in a novel as the protagonist. So there was that challenge as well. Um, I don't know whether he would think of himself as a trickster, but clearly, clearly he is. If he calls to mind anyone, it's the protagonist of The New Moon's Arms, Calamity.
Yes.
And that's partly because he is somebody it would be easy to dislike, but I still wanted people to be able to empathize with him. And first had to deal with that challenge writing Calamity in The New Moon's Arms, where I got done the first draft and thought, I don't like this woman. How can I expect any of my readers to? And had to go back and find the good in her and stuff you could empathize to round her out more. So that was also my challenge with Bekosi. And I find that readers either love him or hate him, or they love to hate him, or they hate to love him, um, because of that duality. He is somebody who desperately wants to be a good person, but his ego keeps getting in the way. His saving grace for me is that he actually does care about other people and eventually starts to listen, and not be so headstrong. But in the beginning, yeah, he's a Lego beast. He has his own head. He just goes and he does what he thinks is best, and devil take the hindmost. Um, and his challenge, his growth, is to learn to be a part of the community, to really be a part of the community.
One of the things I loved about Vic Corsi was that he was honorable. He owned his mistakes, and he would even tell on himself when he didn't have to. You know, when
Yeah,
people were willing to cover up for him. And so I think that helped me love him.
same.
I'm one of the ones who was in love with him. I was vexed with myself. You know, when you love a bad man, I was vexed with myself for loving him.
you,
But I just could not help loving Vikosi.
you said that in the discussion of the book you guys had a few weeks ago, and I loved it. Yeah, you have to some extent love your characters. So I loved him too, but there are times where I just, ooh, dude.
I wanted to lick him down, but I loved him.
Yeah, same thing.
Um, One of the things you mentioned our discussion of the novel. One of the things we got wrong, which I only learned afterwards, of course, is that we thought that Chin Chin was a matriarchy. I watched you in an or listened to an interview with you and someone else, and that other person had made the same mistake. So tell me what we got wrong.
Well, you're not the only ones, and some people also have read it as a character in which, I mean, a novel in which everybody's queer, and that's also not true. But I think it is because we are so unused to seeing um, women treated equally in a society that you see one or two and you think that's all there is. That this must be a matriarchy because women are in charge in parts of their lives. So in Chin Chin, I tried to make it fairly equal, not only in terms of gender, but age and ability. So people have their own power, they have agency. There is one aspect of Chin Chin that is female dominated, and that is the people who go into the sea, the fishers, the sailors, are. They're primarily women. Men can be there, but they are crew, and that's the only aspect of the society that's like that. Other than that, if you look at, say, the caciques, the people who are chiefs, um, the one you meet first is a woman, but by the end, it's a man who's taken over the job, and there's nothing, Children get to try out different careers and choose what they like. Humans being humans, you tend to sort of choose what you have access to and what maybe your parents did. But school is free. You can go and sit down in a classroom and listen and educate yourself. So I tried to make it be as little stratified by gender as I could, and there is more than two genders, um, and that was quite deliberate. It's bemusing to me that people see it as a matriarchy, but I can see why. Same thing with the queerness of the characters. There's only a few that are explicitly queer, but I don't make a big thing of it. So that can strike people as being unusual, and they start to think that that's the whole of the society, but it absolutely is not.
One of the is Kiter, her name was
Um,
the
the little
Queen's,
girl.
yes, and
Hmm.
her transformation to Otenga, that was something else, and it's still very fresh on my mind. Her transformation, her basically embodying a kind of two spirit
Hmm.
um, gendered identity. Could you talk about
Hmm.
that a little bit more, please?
That's Kaira, and there is the cook, the chef.
Yes,
Spoilers,
Cookie.
everybody, lots of spoilers. And one of the heir to the throne from um, the invading
Imisen.
country, Yemisen, is actually third gender. Um, for Kaida, it's not something that she thought to take on. It's something that her biology imposed on her. There is a there was a woman in history. She was a princess. I do not remember what country. Many centuries ago, um, she was married. Her husband went away to war. She fell ill, took to her bed with a fever, and turned out that she was actually male and her testicles hadn't descended when she was born as they normally do. So, and often back then that would be the death of you. The fever would come on, you would die, but she didn't. So she took to her bed female, came out of it male, and went, ha, and started wearing men's clothes and went to war and, just became a man. She just completely took it on, breaking the heart of her husband, who was not apparently willing to be that flexible when he came back and discovered that his queen was now a king. Um, but I love her story and the fact that she just took it on and um, made her new life. They tried to hide it when her husband came back by keeping her wearing women's clothes, but that only lasted until she had to, disrobe in front of him. Um, so that's part of what I was thinking of with the character of Kaida. Uh, and she is in a tradition that is woman only, but that's only because the people who become the avatar of the deity are essentially it's parthenogenesis. They are clones, biological clones. Human biology can't do that, but I'm writing fantasy, so I decided to take it on. Uh, but that's the only reason that they are female. Um, so I decided to mess with the tradition. A lot of fantasy and science fiction starts with when things change in this world that you've built. And that's one of the changes I put Jinshin through, that they have to decide what they're going to do. And they were quite willing to have her continue to be an avatar of the goddess when she became he. Um, but another solution presents itself, which is as much spoiler as I'm going to give. So yes, I ended up just playing gender a lot, and at one point was thinking, well, okay, you can't solve all the plot problems by having somebody become another gender, but it just fit well enough that I decided not to overthink it and just go with it. And in a world I'd created where gender is not as rigid as we try to make it now, um, where there's a recognition that they wouldn't call them trans, but that trans and non-binary people are there and always have been there. Um, it was a pretty easy thing to slot in once the idea came to me.
And I also see, I noticed as well the use of the third, what do you call it, a pronoun IR, and then
Hmm.
E only certain people were referred to in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, they would be the people who are not cis male or cis female. And it's a pretty common set of pronouns for them. The interesting thing is when I first started writing the novel, decade and a half ago, it was jarring. I used the same, came up with the same pronouns and used them, and it was jarring. And now it isn't because now, we're more used to the idea that you can't necessarily break human population neatly into cis male and cis female, and that there are all kinds of pronouns by which people can identify themselves. So now it doesn't. I deliberately came up with words that scan in Caribbean English. You say E go in, right?
Yes.
It'll work. So I wanted it to feel like natural language, but to be clearly pointing to not binarizing gender.
And I did notice that you used E and to describe a lizard at one point. So
Hmm.
I was wondering whether it wasn't just third gender, but if you don't know the gender, you use
You,
these pronouns.
yes. If you don't know the gender, um, so yes, if it's especially if it's an animal and you can't know, yeah, for sure. And some languages do that now, where animals are always gender neutral. So I'm often drawing on things we already do. So that was quite deliberate. He was not going to be able to pick up that lizard and sex it. So he just went to the next set of pronouns.
Yeah, I want to take us back to the history because of course, well, I saw the novel as the usual quarrel we have with colonialism in the Caribbean. And I noticed that, well, it seemed to me that you may have been drawing on the Haitian experience where the French decided that they had to be repaid uh, for the loss of their property. The French decided Haiti had to repay them for the loss of their property
Hmm.
when the Haitian Revolution happened, because the Imisen, they had a narrative, something similar to that. I was wondering if that played into your decision to go that way.
Hmm, for sure. I was also thinking of the Dutch, um, who in slavery days were just as avaricious as anybody else, and who tried to have a lockdown, who did have a lockdown on the production of nutmeg at one point, and who went to Grenada. Now, poor memory. I always have to look these things up before I put them in books. But went to Grenada and were burning down nutmeg plantations. Not their country, but no, they decided nutmeg was theirs. And they would stockpile it in warehouses back home to create a scarcity so that then they could charge more for it. So that was on my mind. Um, Haiti and the fact that it is still in many ways paying for a successful revolution, definitely on my mind. Um, when I was taking history in high school, I had a hard time paying attention to it. But as I've become a fantasy and a science fiction writer, and I have to look up history, and you find out all how interesting it is and how much it speaks to what human beings are like. I've become more fascinated with it. And yes, it does play into quite deliberately into my writing a lot. And I end up doing way more historical research than I had anticipated as a fantasy writer. I knew I would have to do some, but I end up writing so many alternate histories that I spend a lot more time doing historical research than I thought I would.
And speaking of history and the connections between history, truth, and memory, I noted that there's this strong oral tradition and the importance of the scribes, the people, the role that Vikosi was supposed to be initiating into
Hmm.
to record the history of Chin Chin. And at various points in the novel, he would take stories from people and write them down. But throughout, he's always so skeptical of what he's writing down. So it calls to mind this question of who can know the truth of a country's past, who can have access to it, and how so much of what we know of the past or know of any era really is dependent on who has access and who got to write the stories down.
Hmm.
So if you could speak on that a little bit. I know it's not really a question, it's more like an observation. But if you could talk about that a little bit for me,
Yeah,
please.
yeah, for true. I mean, Vikosi is about to be a graduate of uh, the university in Chinchin, the Colloquium of Fellows, I called it. And Chinchin is a nation that is deliberately attempting to survive and thrive outside of, we would say, capitalism. So it needs to make itself self-sufficient. So part of what it has done is created this university that everybody wants to study at because it has access to texts that nobody else does. And what they do is they send their scholars out to search for texts that have been lost throughout the world because one of the casualties of war is books, is knowledge. We have stories of libraries being burned so badly that the river runs black with ash for a few days. We have the story of the library at Alexandria that still kind of makes my heart clench. It's books. You can't destroy books. Anyway, so part of what this university does is collect these books and bring them home. But because they know that they are susceptible to war, they have recourse to the griot tradition, which is a West African tradition that of historians who preserve the history of a place in song, who will create songs about it and will sing and perform those songs to keep history in memory. So these people reason that books can be burned, but we have songs now that we still sing that are centuries old. Songs can stay in memory and can be transferred from one person to another pretty easily. So they not only collect these lost books, they commit them to song. And that worked until I realized that a lot of those books would have illustrations. So part of the committing it to another form that is not as easily destroyed is recreating the illustrations as part of the performance of the song. Um, and so it does make you think about not only memory but ways of preserving and encoding knowledge. They don't have computers; they have music, and music will last, as long as there are humans. Hell, it'll last as long as there are birds. But so that's what they do. Vikosi is a skeptic um, because he knows that a lot of fancifulness creeps into our myths. That myths aren't about recording history; they are about telling the story of who we are as peoples. So often they are fantastical. So that's where his skepticism lies. He is, though, fascinated by the stories that people tell, and he recognizes there's going to be different versions, depending on who told what and who forgot what and who. Um, and of course, by the end, he has to come to terms with the fact that not everything that he thinks of as made up is made up, that some of it actually did happen. Um, but that's kind of the journey that anybody who's obsessed with story ends up on. That um, stuff that we think of as fantastical, the real world is always going to be stranger, no matter what you do. So that's part of what he discovers.
One of the crises in the novel is the children becoming black-hearted, and they lose their soul case, which actually I love the idea that you pull that from Jamaican language. You can explain. I'd like you to explain what the word soul case means to people who are not Jamaican and don't speak the language. But I was also wondering whether you were pulling from the zombie tradition in Haiti in creating the Black-hearted children. So tell us about what a soul case, and tell us about if you pulled
Hmm.
from the zombie tradition.
Yeah. Child, your body, not the soul case. The soul case is your body, right? It's the case that holds your soul. But you also, when you look at some of the Yoruba belief systems as they come over to the Caribbean, they talk about the obi bag, which is a little bag that you wear on your person that carries magic that protects you. And I just combined the two and thought, what if, your soul case literally is this thing that you're carrying that holds the essence of you as yourself. Um, and that's very much in many magical traditions. So people, when they are born in this society, are given a soul case and they can decide what to put into it, but they wear it on their person at all times. And this group of children that's friends to Kaira, to Bekosi's about to be stepdaughter, um, lose their soul cases under circumstances I'm not going to go into details over, but they end up, it shouldn't happen. People, you're not supposed to literally think of the soul case as holding your soul, but when they lose theirs, something happens to them, and they they don't respond easily anymore to other people. They start out quite violent until something stops them, and the community isn't sure what it is that stops them. They forget how to look after themselves. They have to be looked after. And yes, probably Haitian zombification was definitely in my mind. And I am usually always going to make it the original Haitian ethnobiology. I'm usually not going to go to the Hollywood, Living Dead. Um, in Haiti, zombies are not dead. They are human beings who've had their will taken away um, through usually drugs and ritual, and who therefore can only do what people tell them to do. And it was a form of punishment, near as we can tell. So yes, that's definitely on my mind when I was writing about the children. Um, and I had to come up with, why are they violent when it happens? What stops them? How do you deal with a child who has had all its faculties and then comes home and this is what you have? How do you deal with the disabled people in your community? Was all figuring into it. And that's one of the things Vekosi ends up doing, is looking after this group of children um, as their relatives try to figure out how to deal with them. He's the one who's figured some of it out and is able to assist. But what ends up happening is he ends up looking after most of them. He takes them on. It's not that people are dumping them on him. He takes them on. Um, because fiction is about making things worse. So the country's in trouble, he's in more trouble, and then on top of it, you have this war going on, and he's looking after 13 children who don't have their full faculties and trying to keep them safe on top of everything else. They tell you not to put children, fire, and dogs in your stories, or animals, and I often end up doing at least two of the three. I don't put 13 of them. I had to keep going and looking up their names because I forgot who was who and who was what gender and who was. It was a headache.
I'm afraid we've run out of time,
Oh my.
but before we close, Nalo is going to read an excerpt from the novel for us. It's a wonderful novel. Everybody should read it. And thank you so much for being with us, Nalo. It was
So this is from near the beginning of the novel Blackheart Man, where you're meeting the three characters that are converging for the action to start, and they are Andrew, Datiao, and Vikosi. Home. After so many years, to be home. Standing on the deck of the innocent ship, the Empire Star, Andrew couldn't still his traitor heart from leaping in his breast at the sight of the graceful sweep of Carnage Bay, the coconut and Gruberbeth palms blowing in a gentle breeze, the colibri birds circling on the draughts in the air above. So long since he had set foot on Chinchin soil. The captain gave the order for the sailor to run up the flags that would signal to the rest of the fleet to break away. Those ships would put in at deserted Boar Island a short distance away. They would load up with fresh water, hunt boar and dry the meat, and wait until they were sent for. Then they would arrive in force and take this wretched island of Chin, turn it back into Imison territory of sorts. That is, if the new Imison regime would acknowledge Tyrce's right to succeed to the throne, now that it had deposed Tyrce's father. The steersman longingly eyed the bay. They had been weeks at full sail. Standing nearby with the captain, Advisor Gunderson stared at the bay too and grunted his relief. Well, he might. They would get their precious passengers safely to their destination after all. All this for a book. But the trip would bring Andrew, finally, his revenge. The captain called out, "Full ahead!" to the steersman. So busy were Andrew's eyes taking in the sight of Chin Island that he nearly overlooked the small spinning swirls of foam a scant few ells in front of them. Two smaller circles lay in a line pointing at them, leading to the largest one, which was closest to the bay. When Andrew did notice them, the back of his neck prickled. "Hard to!" he yelled at the steersman. "Now!" Gods blast it, they were about to run up on Mamago's pearls. The steersman squinted at him but looked to the captain for his orders. The captain and Gunderson gave Andrew a suspicious glare. Damned Emerson prigs like Gunderson would never trust him, for all that he had blood such as theirs running in his veins. "Heave to!" Andrew barked. "You'll have us run aground." Fear sweat crawled beneath his collar. Dachau drew breath at last, but straightway he met blockage. No air to fill his lungs, no way for his chest to expand, even had there been air in it. All he got for his pains was a hot honey trickle of black piche sliding into his nose and tickling down the back of his throat. His body spasmed, but there was no way to cough so as to expel the piche. How long had he been embalmed this way in sludgy blackness? Long enough for him to unlearn the habit of breathing, but it had come back to him just now. All it needed was air for him to practice the skill proper. Then the three bitches would rue their borning days. Vikosi realized he had been standing still on the pipe, transfixed in shock at the sight of the innocent ships. He'd lost track of how much time he had before the water dissolved the clay jars he dropped into the reservoir. 9 minutes, 50 seconds, 9 minutes 38. His heart swelled his throat near shut. Teetering a little, he hot-footed it to the end of the pipe, jumped down, and broke into a pounding run down the path. 9 minutes, 22 seconds, 21. The foot of the hill was looking farther away than it had on his way up here. 8 minutes, 58 seconds, 57. Soon he was scurrying down the part of the footpath along the very edge of Calibri Hill that led down to the town. 8:32. He glanced up to the top of the ridge, where the jars in the reservoir were surely dissolving. There was going to be hell to pay for losing the book. Maybe he'd be able to fish it out once this was all over. Perhaps some of the words would have survived. "Where ships?" he yelled to the town below. Not that they could hear him at this distance. He leapt over a patch of prickly scrub that was barring his way. He skidded on slippery moss on the other side. His feet slipped out from under him. He landed hard on one hip, the breath exploding from his lungs. Before he could brace himself, he slid out over the edge of the cliff. His legs kicked air. He scrabbled at the ground, at the skittering rock stones, his forehead dislodged, at anything. He managed to grab a sapling. It whipped through his hands, skinning his palms. Frantic, he tightened his grip. The green stick sapling cracked, but didn't break. He blinked dirt out of his eyes and looked up at it. Its roots were starting to pull free. He dug his elbows into the lip of rock and paddled his feet around, feeling for purchase. But there was only air. He twisted his body to look down over his shoulder. Red dirt cliffside all the way to the water, the black, deep water. Rocks dislodged by his fall were bouncing at speed down the cliff. One of the rock stones sprang away from the hillside. He was up so high he didn't hear the splash when it hit the sea surface. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck. His shoulders burned with the strain of carrying his own weight. If he let go, he would fall into the bay, likely crack his spine like a twig when he hit the water from such a great height. There! One foot had found a solid place. He jammed the foot into a shallow crevice in the rock. A breeze ran chilly fingers up under his robe. He still couldn't lever himself up, and he'd lost complete track of how much time had passed. Help! He bellowed into the echoing bell of flesh made by his chest and arms pressed against the cliff face. A gusty updraft plucked at his hair and the hem of his robe. His hands were slipping down the length of the sapling. 6 minutes? 47 seconds left? 46? Help!